Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by prolific author Yves Engler. He's published 11 books and is also an active journalist who is constantly creating and being published in many mediums. However, one of your most important books perhaps has been for me the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. So I'm delighted to have Yves Engler join us this morning to talk a little bit about Canadian foreign policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if you could paint a picture for us. What has been the legacy of the Canadian government? You know, we never think of Canada as an empire, but there is a legacy of empire and colonization. And so perhaps you can just give us an image of what this looks like for people who don't pay attention to all the things that are happening in the world.
Well, I mean, Canadian foreign policy is basically driven by support for empire, historically British, today American, and support for Canadian corporate interests. And despite the rhetoric, it's much more militaristic than people often recognize. I think what we're seeing in Afghanistan today with the Taliban taking over all the major cities of the country, they've been in control of lots of the landmass for quite a while, but now they've taken even Kabul. So once U.S. troops pulled out, or most U.S. troops pulled out, basically the government that we had been backing for 2 decades just sort of collapsed, even with barely without any fighting. And that's a legacy of Canada's most important war since World War II. About 40,000 Canadian troops were in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. And all this killing, and most of the killing was, of course, Afghans who died, depending on, it's not clear exactly how many, but certainly into the 100,000 minimum and hundreds of thousands, depending exactly on how you quantify, the indirect deaths. And this was, a war that most of the Canadian media, the Canadian establishment, political parties celebrated for the vast majority of this 13 year of Canadian troops being in Afghanistan, and it should lead to a defunding of the Canadian military. It should lead to the disbanding of the arms companies, and it should lead to a lot of embarrassment for the different think tanks and militarist associations that promoted this war. But unfortunately, it's unlikely to do that much of that, because even when their imperial wars collapse on them, even by their own standards, there's little accountability. It's not just in Afghanistan. We've seen that with Libya, where Canada played an important role in the bombing and NATO war in Libya, and it turned into a total disaster. Libya is still basically at a civil war, and there's no accountability for Canada's role there either. So, Canadian foreign policy is, like I said, very much aligned with empire, aligned with advancing corporate interests, and heavy on the rhetoric of democracy, women's rights, helping the poor. But if you actually look more closely, it's really about geostrategic and corporate calculations.
One of the things that you do really well is helping us unpack this very well-crafted PR campaign that Canada is a humanitarian nation. Can we talk a little bit about this presence in the world where, we're constantly showing up pretending to be humanitarians? But Haiti has recently had another disastrous earthquake, and You wrote an article saying, with friends like Canada, Haiti's in trouble. And can you talk about why you wrote this article? What's the significance of our presence in Haiti in the past decade?
Yeah, well, so first of all, there was a terrible earthquake a couple days ago in that hit particularly the southwest of the country. Didn't hit in any significant way the capital, the biggest, by far the biggest city, Port-au-Prince, but it did hit pretty badly Les Cayes, a smaller city, and a couple of other urban centers. The numbers are still coming in terms of deaths, but the latest is something like over 1,500 people dead. I think 6,000 people injured. Clearly, thousands and thousands of people who've been made homeless and lost the little bit that they had. And so it's clearly quite devastating. It's also very traumatic because 10 years ago, 11 years ago, there was a terrible earthquake that left tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands dead, mostly in Port-au-Prince. So for all those people who went through that previous earthquake, it's obviously very traumatic to have another similar type of experience. So this is a time when there should be international solidarity. Canada has lots that it could offer from the standpoint of helping in the context of an earthquake. It's a common practice for countries to support each other when there's international, when there's major disasters. Like right now there are Mexican firefighters helping out with forest fires in British Columbia, and that's a very good kind of practice of concrete solidarity in times of difficulty. So that's what one would hope that Canada would do. The problem is that there's something called history, and the history is that Canada has used these disasters in Haiti, not just the earthquake most in 2010, most obviously, but other disasters, tropical storms, has basically used these to increase its power over the country. Like the 2010 earthquake, as opportunities, well, sees them both as political crises to manage and opportunities to deepen control. So, for instance, after 2010, Canada basically pushed elections to get rid of sort of mildly social democratic president René Préval, and use the weakness of the Haitian state after the earthquake to put in place this neo-Duvalierist thug, Michel Martelly, who's part of this violent. And he was a member of the Tonton Macoute, who were the violent arm of the 30-year Duvalier dictatorship when he was younger. And so we used this to gain greater control over Haiti. We sent a couple thousand troops after the earthquake in 2010. We didn't send the heavy urban search and rescue teams. And according to the internal government documents, Canadian government documents, they sent the troops to ensure that the former ousted president Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who we had forced out of the country in 2004, overthrew his elected government, that to make sure that he didn't come back amidst the power vacuum after the earthquake, and to ensure that there wasn't some sort of like popular revolt after the earthquake. So that's why we sent 2,000 troops. We have this horrible, horrible devastation. And the U.S. sends something like 15,000 troops, and Canada sends 2,000 troops, not primarily to protect, to aid Haitians, but to guarantee political control over the country. That's the relationship that we're locked into with regards to Haiti. Canadian policy has been one of undermining Haitian democracy, undermining Haitian sovereignty, undermining, quite frankly, Haitians' capacity to deal with earthquakes. Because the problem is not just that Haiti is on fault lines with regards to earthquakes. That is clearly a problem, but it's that the infrastructure is so poor that it collapses, even when the earthquakes aren't that strong of an earthquake. Similar type of earthquake, if it was to hit Vancouver or Tokyo, there would be some damage. There'd probably be, some people who would lose their lives, but it would be, quite few. But because the infrastructure is so poor in Haiti, and it's without even many, big buildings. It's that, 2-3-story buildings are collapsing and people dying that could very, very easily be built in ways that were earthquake resistant, but the place has been so impoverished. And it's been impoverished by a long history of French, U.S., Canadian domination and determining of Haitian affairs. So that's sort of some of the context for the article I wrote. And I just want to go in slightly different direction. But a week ago, two people from the Rideau Institute, which is a supposedly left-wing Canadian foreign policy think tank, Walter Dorn and Peggy Mason. Peggy Mason's the head of the Rideau Institute. They published a commentary, an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, where they basically, it was on August 9th, which is Peacekeepers Day. I think it's either national or international Peacekeepers Day. And they basically complained about how this lack of Canada's involvement in UN peacekeeping, and we need more Canadian involvement in UN peacekeeping, and just this sort of ode to this mythology of Canada as a peacekeeping nation. Well, this op-ed from these supposedly progressive writers, officials, it just completely ignores that Canada's most important peacekeeping mission in recent years was in Haiti in 2004. It was a peacekeeping mission that helped in overthrowing the elected government, that oversaw or protected this coup government that killed thousands of people. And then the UN force that we instigated with the US and France after overthrowing the elected government, it brought cholera into Haiti because they were so indifferent about Haitian lives that they were dumping their sewage, their feces in water that people were drinking from, and tens of thousands of Haitians died because of this cholera. And even after they introduced cholera, UN bases were found to continue to be dumping their waste in this completely inappropriate manner that led to like more than 1 million people ill. Like a big proportion of the whole country got ill from this cholera that hadn't known more than a century. There was no history of cholera in Haiti. So when supposed progressives write in the pages of the Globe Mail, we need more Canadian peacekeeping, you ask yourself, do we need more of what Canada did in Haiti when they overthrew the elected government? We brought in this peacekeeping force that killed all kinds of people after the coup, and then occupied the country for basically 17 years. And right until today, the UN is no longer a major military mission, but it continues to be a major political player in determining Haitian affairs. This is sort of progressive opinion in Canada is even, just sort of blindly supporting peacekeeping as if it's ipso facto a good thing because it has a UN okay of it. Ignoring further history of Canada's UN mission, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, or the fact that the Korean War in the early 1950s was also a UN mission. So this is the reality of the discussion of Canadian foreign policy is, truth is completely excluded from the official discussion. You have this narrowness of debate between the hard militarists who are like, yeah, let's just send our troops to go kill people, and then the people who are saying, no, what we need to do is we need to be more engaged with UN missions, and completely ignoring the power dynamics and often the imperial character of those UN missions. And the case of Haiti is unfortunately a preeminent example of the just complete backwardness of Canadian foreign policy discussion.
I was in Haiti in 2011, months after the earthquake had taken place, and months after millions and millions of dollars had been gathered from people who care, who sent money to alleviate the problem. And when we were there, you were right. There were UN vehicles that were like completely brand new with air condition, and the whole place was militarized. Meanwhile, the people had no water. There was no water to drink. The hotel we stayed at was compromised, had a huge crack on it. And when you turned the water that came back was black. And so you have all these very rich nations present, sucking up a lot of the money that had been sent for Haitian people. There was no evidence that work was being done on restructuring or creating homes for people. What was very evident was that the beaches, the areas where people had owned homes were being, the people were kept from those areas. And eventually we know what happens, right? Those areas are taken up and they're given to hotels and whatever, just like it happened in New Orleans, with people who were displaced there as well. So I think for us to remember is that colonization and racism go hand in hand, right? Empire happens because we are able to see other people as less deserving. And the story we're fed is that, there's just so much corruption in those countries. Those people are so natural. It's like almost like, it's a natural occurrence that people in Latin America, people in the Caribbean, people in Africa are just corrupt and violent. That we don't see the history of violence that is constantly being imposed, and we don't see that actually the violence is coming to them, that they're not the ones creating it a lot of the times. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, with when you have a foreign policy so violent towards others, you can be one thing somewhere and another thing somewhere else, right? I find that same violence also gets reverberated internally, towards your own indigenous people and poor people in this country. Can you talk a little bit about how that not only is seen manifested in the kinds of policies we see today, whether it be pipelines or displacement of indigenous people, but the kinds of aggressions that we're seeing unfolding?
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to make really clear with regards to like corruption and violence in Haiti, for instance, we put in place, like not in an abstract sense, which is the case in many places where, to create the conditions that enable the rise of these sort of right-wing forces. But in the case of Haiti, we put, over the past decade, we have put in place these far-right mafioso types to lead Haiti. And it's like concurrently or previously, since 2000, we destroyed the most popular political party in Haitian history. That was a pro-poor party that was trying to sort of overcome many of the inequities and dysfunctions of Haitian society. So on one hand, we put in place and have backed up these mafioso types, but previous to that, we enabled these far right forces by undercutting these sort of popular, mildly progressive, there's nothing revolutionary, it's mild kind of reformist. So yeah, it's very concrete kind of engagement in the violence. Now I think that certainly the racisms come home, right? When you have the media sphere framing Haiti as this completely backward place, unable to, govern its affairs, and this, all this kind of colonial type imagery, that of course has a negative impact on the standing, how Haitians, particularly in Canada, are viewed, and also more generally Black people. So there is definitely the colonial kind of imperial kind of ideological efforts. Racisms do have a consequence, within what we call Canada. An important way to understand Canadian foreign policy is as basically an extension of the British Empire that conquered Turtle Island, right? Probably the clearest is with the Canadian military. The Canadian military, is the force that helped conquer these lands from Indigenous people. The Canadian military is the British military until some point. It's never exactly clear when it formally goes from the British to the Canadian, but there's sort of steps, and at one point it's formally a Canadian military, but it's still all staffed by British officials that have been involved in conquering all around the world. And we still have the name Royal. It's still the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Canadian Navy. So the Canadian military has always seen itself as part of the preeminent imperial force in the world. Studies that have shown this, compared the Canadian attitudes of Canadian military commanders to some other militaries that have a connection to Britain, the Indian, Argentinian, and some other countries. And the Canadian military commanders see themselves as part of this dominating force. So the Argentinian military officials see themselves as sort of a influential regional force, but the Canadian military officials see themselves as part of like a global, in polite terms, they would say, policeman. But what that really is saying is, part of this global, at this point, U.S.-led empire, historically, of course, British Empire. And how does that manifest itself within Canada? There's been a whole history of the Canadian military, obviously dispossessing Indigenous people, also repressing strikes. That was what the Canadian military did or the militia did for decades, and they repressed dozens and dozens of strikes into the 1930s. There's elements that continue right up until today, where you see the military was spying on Black Lives Matters protests, spying on different Indigenous Idle No More and other Indigenous uprisings. So the reality is that at this point we've kind of contained the military in its domestic functions to having eliminated the worst of the abuses. The worst of the abuses take place abroad, but it's still this force within Canadian political life. And then taking another part of Canadian foreign policy and domestic policy, like something like the mining sector. Well, the mining sector, Canada is a global mining powerhouse. Well, that's completely tied to a history of exploiting First Nations lands and developing a level of expertise, developing a level of capital accumulation, and that process isn't just historical. It obviously continues as well, where there's extraction taking place, and many times contested extraction on Indigenous lands. And again, the same kind of dynamic generally plays out, is that, yes, the ecologically abusive and sometimes, violent nature of that extraction, the worst of the abuses usually take place abroad. So, take place in the countries of the most impoverished and weakest. So, a Canadian company in the Congo or a Canadian company in Guatemala would tend to be more ecologically damaging and more violent than that same company operating in Canada, even on Indigenous lands, because they're somewhat more constrained by different political constraints. But yes, the more these companies get empowered in their international operations, the more we see that power manifest within Canada as well. So yes, there is definitely the connections between foreign policy and domestic abuses, domestic exploitation, and domestic injustices.
It also naturalizes violence. The more we attack and destroy people's ability to elect the governments they choose, as in the case of Haitian people being denied, Aristide to even participate in the elections, and to destroy the Lavalas party, to destroy any sense of autonomy within the people, the more you're going to have people who are desperate, who will risk their lives to go back to the places that are colonizing them. When we start seeing the victims as the aggressors, right? Instead of seeing how they were victimized and how the aggression has forced them to flee, to leave, to be displaced, to be refugees and migrants in other places. When we start to make those connections, then perhaps we will start to take more responsibility. when you think about our role as Canadian people, I mean, the time of pandemic, everybody seems to be running scared. And it seems to me the government has taken a lot of liberties in terms of policies, whether it be financing the fossil fuel industry, or whether it be siphoning large portions of our taxes to industries that perhaps citizens wouldn't agree upon. How do you see us moving a post-pandemic future where we can have participatory actions towards justice?
It's the same, sort of standard thing as previous. It's work. It's just organizing. It's mobilizing. It's anti-war activism. It's solidarity activism. It's mining injustice campaigning. It's building up progressive media that doesn't just say what the powerful want to hear. I think that the pandemic opened up some political opportunities, but I think it has made people fearful, and fear is generally not something that's good for progressive, socialistic type of political movements. It tends to be actually more beneficial to sort of right-wing, conservative kind of movements. But what the pandemic has shown is that, first of all, that governments can create money, if you want to frame it like that. That's not exactly correct, but basically that they have the means, the capacity to intervene, to move us away from fossil fuels, or build tens of thousands of units of social housing, or these different things that they claim there was no money for. That's never been correct. It's a matter of mobilizing the resources behind these projects, and we have human beings who have the skills, want to do the work. So we could have a serious effort of mitigating the climate crisis by, for instance, building tens, even hundreds of thousands of units of co-op and social housing and centers of cities that are, car-free housing that deals with the housing crisis that we have and the affordability issues around housing in a number of major cities, but also helps mitigate the climate chaos that we're seeing. So I think that the pandemic offers some, I think has opened some people's eyes up to some of those questions. I also think that the forest fires and the floods and different so-called natural disasters taking place all around the world has made it just completely clear that there needs to be absolutely radical transformation if we want to have a chance to have some form of human civilization in 100 years or 150 years from now, if there's not radical reductions in greenhouse gases.
Thank you so much for all the things that you do, for all the ways that you bring clarity. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thanks, Sonia.
Take care. Bye. Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.